Hello again and welcome back to Soul GPS. I wanted to follow up on my last video that I recorded about the influence of culture and society on our choices, on the people that we end up being with, on our relationships in general. How we interact with each other? How do we perceive one another? And I wanted to add this little bit because I just came across this very interesting research, and I think it really adds dimension to what I had mentioned in my previous video. And this research basically points to a couple of interesting data points. The first one deals with the division that we have in the world currently between individualistic cultures, which is basically what we have, you could say, in the West. So North America, Europe, those primarily are those regions. And then we have collectivistic cultures, which seem to be primarily situated in the East, so East Asia, Southeast Asia, those areas that from which we get philosophies and religions that put a lot more impact on relationships, interrelationships between people versus the striving towards excellence by one individual, or the hero culture. So it seems that what determines that split, which way people go, can be taken back to a time when we were developing agriculture on our planet. And more specifically, the people who seem to be a little bit more, actually vastly more, inclined towards working together versus those who are more individualistic, seems to point towards the difference in crops that were being raised. So in Asia, Southeast Asia, the more collectivistic cultures, the kind of crop that was and is primarily cultivated is rice. And what it turns out is that growing rice requires massive coordination between multiple families, multiple villages. We're looking at the management of water system across hundreds of miles. So people needed to communicate with one another, and they relied on one another when it comes to the planning and execution of the crops, of raising the crops, of planting, of raising, and then collecting the crops. Versus in the West, what is the primary crop that we grow? It is wheat. You could also add corn, but for this particular research I wanted to cite, they were talking specifically more about the wheat. And I will also link the video that I came across from which I sourced this information. It's from Dr. Robert Sapolsky, so that you can go closer to the source and enjoy that, because it's a fantastic conversation that he has there with a podcast producer. So we have the wheat in the West, and wheat is it doesn't require the coordination of that many people. It's usually a family, or could be a village. So I come from Eastern Europe, and my grandfather on my mother's side, he is from West Ukrainian region, and he used to tell us stories. He used to tell them mostly to my mom because I was too small, but then my mom would tell me. It's a beautiful story of how in his village families would plant the wheat, but then when it came to harvest, what they would do is, let's say there would be 10 farm families living close to each other and having their fields next to one another. And when it came to harvest in around August time, what they would do is they would gather all the men from all 10 families, and they would go and cut down the wheat, which is very labor-intensive work. A little bit less so today because we have machines, but back then they used to do it all by hand using a scythe. So they would come together, and they would have the whole, the whole male population work for one farmer, and then in the evenings, the women would organize a feast and they would bring in the village musicians, and they would build a big bonfire, and they would have a feast and share. Of course, the family whose crops were cut down that day would be the ones organizing, and they would party and have a good time, and then the next day they would move on to the next neighbor and the next neighbor, and it just created this really, I think, wonderful way of sharing together, right? Something that unfortunately we don't have in this day and age. Our technology has allowed us to do magnificent things, but there's always two sides of the coin, and the shadow side of the coin, I guess I'd call it, is the fact that we're losing face-to-face contact with one another and substituting with basically what I'm doing now, which is also great, because I can be here and talk to you, and you are all over the world, and then you can reply back to me and we can have a conversation, which is amazing. But the face-to-face part has diminished significantly. So, but still, even though this was this was happening during harvest, this was in August, and they did have that special time of coming together, and throughout the year families lived close together because they relied on one another for survival. Again, stories from my family say this very clearly. When my mom was a child, she was about a teenager, let's just say about child to teenager, she needed to help on the farm, and we had everything. Her family, we had everything. The only thing that my grandfather used to have to go to the city, to the town for to buy would be matches and spirit, so alcohol, which he needed for to make different herbs and things like that. I don't know that maybe they were drinking it too, but I don't think so, because they made their own alcohol, from the fermented vegetables and fruits. So these were the only two things that they didn't have, that they couldn't produce. Everything else was produced. So very difficult life. I want to emphasize it was. It had its challenges, but there was that togetherness. Still, coming back to the topic of collectivistic versus individualistic, wheat does not require that many people, the collaboration of hundreds of families across a vast swath of land to make it happen. So you can see how that, something that's, I would say, just about as encoded in our DNA, into our DNA, is having an impact on the way that we relate to one another. What do we notice when we look at a picture? So this is also quoting from the research, from the video that cited the research, that I will link to the video, about what people from individualistic cultures notice when they're looking at a picture with many faces in it versus those who are from an individualistic culture. So I would most likely notice, since I'm in the West, the person in the middle. That's where my eyes would go first, is who is in the middle, versus someone who is from, let's say, Thailand or Indonesia, would most likely notice the people on the periphery, because those people who are on the periphery, people who surround us, make a very significant impact on our own life and our own decisions. One more little bit of research I will cite here, which I think is very interesting. Again, this is pulling it from that video that's down below, in case if you don't have time to watch it, or if you don't want to, just to put it out there, is the impact of infectious diseases, the impact that it has on people's position on immigrants. So it turns out that in the area of the world, for example, where I am, which is in Central Eastern Europe currently, what people in this region, the reason why, and I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about my culture right now, on average, we are not particularly immigrant friendly. You may disagree, because we're also very hospitable. We love when people come and visit us. But when it comes to massive amount of immigrants moving to my country, a lot of people will take a big issue of that. There is a fear of otherness. I think that's what it comes down to. And I always pondered, where does it come from? And it turns out that the reason why some people have that, again, kind of almost like wired into them. It's cultural, of course. By saying that it's in our DNA, I exaggerated. I went a little bit too far, because it's not necessarily as biological, although it may trigger the biology. It may trigger a biological response of, for example, aggression or disgust or fear, but still it's wired in through culture. Is that we were afraid during the time of great plagues that ravaged Europe, that ravaged this region. We were worried of people who were coming from the outside into the city because they may carry the disease. So again, this can be taken many ways. This could be interpreted many ways. But I just wanted to record this video not to tell who's immigrant friendly versus who isn't. Of course, that remains an individual thing in this region, because we're much more individualistic. But just to paint a picture a little bit more clearly as to the impact that our history, our biology, our DNA, again, this is generational, our culture has on how we perceive one another and the way we approach relationships. So I hope this was helpful. Again, I look forward to your questions, comments. Your likes are always very much appreciated, and I will see you in another video. Take good care. Bye-bye.